Summer of 1966, I'm due for orders. I'm a battalion air liaison officer, and my relief shows up. First Lieutenant Phillip Jennings, straight from flying helicopters in Vietnam, and he shows up armed with his TO weapon, which was a guitar. And he announced that his ambition in life was to become the world's first successful right-wing folk singer. He failed miserably at that. I went off flying for Air America, and 2 years later, in walks the new guy over there to fly helicopters also, Phil Jennings, armed with an even more dangerous weapon. He had an up-to-date shot card. So I leave, wind up back in Atlanta. 2 years later, back in Atlanta, Phil Jennings shows up with an even more dangerous weapon, a business suit. And he did okay in business, but then he decided that he needed to get a little more education, went down to Mexico, studied anthropology at the University of Mexico, but he was armed with the most dangerous weapons of all at that point in time. He had a student visa and a typewriter. Yeah, so his first love, of course, was writing. And even though he's been very successful in business, that is his first love, but it was a struggle for a while. One time he called me up to read to me a letter that he had received, that his literary agent had received, a rejection letter from a major publishing house. And the letter said, "May Mr. Jennings' hands be mutilated in an industrial machinery accident before he is permitted near a keyboard again." Now, after I stopped laughing, I said, Jennings, that's good writing. Okay? And he learned his lesson from that, and he did become a successful writer. 2 novels, Namarama, Goodbye Mexico, and the one that would probably be of most interest to this crowd, because this is one of the most politically incorrect crowds I know, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Vietnam War. I highly recommend it. He's also won the Faulkner Prize from the Faulkner Society in New Orleans for the best short story of whatever year that was, several years ago. Now, his first novel, Namarama, you might call it what might be called the catch-22 of our generation, but really it wasn't. It was the Dagger 2 Fox, or the Sauce 1-4, or the Joker 9-4. It was all of the call signs and nom de guerre and nicknames that we used with each other to depersonalize ourselves and pretend that we were not emotionally involved in the war. And I think we've all come to realize that we were all emotionally involved in the war. And I can't think of anybody that expresses that better than my friend of, well, he was my friend before I started this introduction anyway, but my friend of 47 years, Phil Jennings.
It's great to be here. 40-some years ago, I came to Atlanta and I met my wife. And I still like Atlanta. I mean, it's okay. I mean, but they didn't get it, I guess. I am still at war in Vietnam. I think a lot of us are. In my case, I have a Viet Cong barber. And I've had him for about 10 years. I've never tipped him. He's never given me a decent haircut. My wife says, "For God's sakes, Philip, give it up. The guy is going to outlive you." But nope, this is what he does, and I'm not tipping him. He does keep raising his prices, so he may be smarter than I am. I don't know. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about, obviously, the Vietnam War. A little bit of it. Can you hear me okay back there? It's okay, John? Yeah. Yeah? All right. He was asleep. I'm sorry. The Vietnam War has been a part of my life since I was a kid. When Dien Bien Phu fell in 1954, I was about 13 years old, and I read the headlines in the Wichita Eagle. My dad was a Boeing guy in Wichita. and it said Dien Bien Phu Falls. And I was kind of a romantic kid. I read a lot even then and tried to do some writing. And it just struck me that a country like France could lose a war in a small Asian country. And so I started reading about the war. And so earlier than most, certainly Marine officers, most of whom didn't read till they were in the service, more than a lot of the Marine officers I served with, I actually knew a lot about Vietnam before I went to Vietnam. And as I tell the story, so that was in 1954, and I got to see Dien Bien Phu in 1968. It was shot down about 5 minutes later. It's a true story. And I always felt like there was some sort of destiny there. It's with a guy named J.J. McDonald. What's his name, Larry?
J.J.
McCauley, yeah. And J.J., as soon as he let me fly, we were on my first hop in Air America flying in northern Laos. He was a really good guy, flying age 34, and I was in the right seat, which for you fixed-wing guys, that's where the pilot sits. And he said, we were talking about Dien Bien Phu, and he said, yeah, I'll show it to you. So we went tooling up there, and we kind of lost our bearings, and we were looking for where we were supposed to land, and we landed where we were supposed to land. And I remember the first time I'd ever, at least in Air America, I remember getting shot at because I was, if you guys that fly choppers, you know, they have rearview mirrors. So you kind of watch the tail rotor and see if anybody's sticking their rifle up in it or something if you're on the landing pad. And I noticed the rearview mirror just left. I thought, well, that's kind of strange. Those of you, and I guess a lot of you, have been shot at. It's so surreal, certainly the first few times, that it's hard to realize what's happening. So the rearview mirror is gone, and then the rudder pedal starts shaking, and JJ, it's a true story, is still reading the Wall Street Journal. So anyway, today's talk. It's kind of a serious subject. I speak a lot about the Vietnam War. Like I say, I've studied it for 30 years, 40 years. When I wrote the Politically Incorrect Guide to the Vietnam War, I thought it was a great honor to be chosen to write that book. And they asked me how long it would take to write it, and I said I could probably write it in 6 months. And they said, it's perfect, that's our publishing schedule. Then they gave me the format. Now, I don't know whether you guys, many of you ever seen the Politically Incorrect Guide format, but it's 250 pages, and it's divided into each chapter has to stand alone. It has to be some history and some anecdotes, and your reading public is somewhere between 17 years old and 85 years old. And it's not easy to do. It took me 18 months to write it because if you try to put the war, all the sides of the war, the good news, bad news, good guys, bad guys, political history, etc., into 240 pages with pictures, it is not easy. And but it was a great honor to write it, and I've enjoyed going around speaking about it. Today I'm going to spend a little time on something else, though. Larry has warned me about being too political. I'm not sure what that means, but it is about my view toward what's wrong with the country today and why it traces itself back to Vietnam. I'm going to read you a couple of quotes. Political correctness is to culture what Marxism is to economics, and I absolutely believe that statement. Political correctness is to culture what Marxism is to economics. Political correctness in this country is enforced by the media, and the media has permanently divorced itself from the American opinion during the Vietnam War. Breaking the symbiotic relationship between the media and the government is one of the biggest challenges America has. The U.S. is now an ideological state. We live in cultural Marxism. Like Marxism, political correctness is simply the denial of reality. Now, why does that have anything to do with Vietnam? I hope I can show you quickly. I'm going to more or less read this. Believe me, it's to your advantage. I have ADD so bad. If I simply started talking, we could be talking about the price of bologna in Zimbabwe before you would ever get me back on this subject. I have that lecture if anybody ever wants to hear it, by the way. The era of the Vietnam War was a perfect storm. The combat was predicated on a flawed strategy, overseen by inept civilians. Our country was experiencing major civil unrest, Drug usage was skyrocketing due to the infrastructure of distribution systems for drugs. The country began questioning its history and its motives. The feminist movement and birth control fueled a so-called sexual revolution, and the backlash from McCarthyism had emboldened the left beyond all reason. The people of South Vietnam and their future actually became a secondary consideration in the prosecution of the war. If you think about it, and most of us thought about it, the discussions of the war for over 10 years, 20 years, 30 years was about our reaction to the war, what it did to us, what it did to America, and very little about what it actually did to Vietnamese. And during the war was no different. There was a glimmer of sanity, and I always get a lot of comments usually depending on the crowd, but there was a glimmer of sanity when we elected Nixon. Nixon was the first president to ever simply put a priority on an issue that was killing American soldiers at the time. Watergate quickly, just almost immediately eclipsed that, however. The liberal media had no trouble defenestrating Nixon and teamed with the Democratic Congress. The media ended the war. It ended in a way more shameful than a military defeat. We simply forfeited all that we had bought and paid for. And it wasn't the coverage by the liberal media that was so horrible. It was simply the selective coverage and the editorializing of the war. From the individual reporters up through the newsroom to the publishers and to the owners, they actually editorialized all the time about the war. And there is no doubt that a substantial element of the American media, including print and television, became shills for the anti-war, anti-American crowd, sometimes with factual misrepresentations and sometimes with propaganda. I know that not all liberal media and all protesters against the war fit the same profile. But one thing I do know, enough fit the leftist profile to change the course and the outcome of the war. It wasn't an accident, and it wasn't unplanned, and it wasn't undirected. Let me set the stage of the war, because amazingly when I talk about the war, particularly younger groups, their first impression is it was some sort of immoral, unjust war that we kind of stumbled into, didn't really know why we were there, didn't know why we were fighting, and we were just out of place. But remember that. At the end of World War II, Russia exposed itself as not a friend of the West. France had its economy devastated, and it asked for Indochina back to try to get its finances back in good shape. And it said if we don't get Indochina back, we're going to have to go to the Russians. We're going to have to go to the communists. And one thing that Eisenhower and Churchill didn't want was a communist France. Then China fell to Mao. Tens of millions of people killed in the late 40s. Then China supported North Korea. Lord knows how many Chinese poured into North Korea, and they fought us to a stalemate. Then China helped North Vietnam defeat the French. And if those of you who haven't studied Vietnam a lot, you probably don't realize how much the Chinese were involved in defeating the French at Dien Bien Phu. And in fact, I do business in China now. I've had a company there for years. And in their school books, they teach the Chinese beat the French with some sort of assistance from the North Vietnamese. By the 60s, communism had become the deadliest killer in history. But then tentatively and without a strategic plan, we first faced the communists down in Southeast Asia and Laos. But we did it almost as an afterthought and without a lot of paying attention. And what did we do? We simply said, okay, you guys, the communists, can have Eastern Laos, but try to stay out of Western Laos. And we didn't even have a way to back that up. And what that meant was that for the next 15 years, we simply had given the communists the lifeline for the invasion and the eventual conquest of South Vietnam. It was one of the two biggest mistakes we made in the Vietnam War. The other one, which is somewhat controversial, but which I believe strongly in fact, there's a conference in in Washington, D.C. in September, which this is the subject. First one was giving them the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The second one was defeating Diem. With Diem in power, we probably would have shortened that war by 7 or 8 years. Again, not everybody believes that, but you need to go back and read about Diem, what he was and what he was about. So here we are. The communists are just taking over the world. Russia's taking over countries in Eastern Europe as fast as they can. So what do we decide to do in Vietnam? We decided to fight a limited war. And a limited war is a war of wills. A limited war begins with the concept of leveling the playing field in war, based on, among other things, the belief that it is morally repugnant for a greater power to use all of its resources on a lesser opponent. And the United States of America may be the most ill-equipped nation in the history of the world to win a limited war. Certainly we have military supremacy, but we're burdened with decency and compassion, a Judeo-Christian heritage, which some now deny, and a free press. And one of the greatest weapons a nation can have in a limited war is total control of the press. And if a nation can control its press and influence its enemy's press, you have North Vietnam situation during the war. And again, the West faced the fastest expanding, most deadly communism in history, and chose the least effective method of challenging it, limited war, and combined that with the complete abrogation of the most critically necessary weapon in a war, propaganda and public opinion. As the North Vietnamese and later the Russians said, the battlefields of South Vietnam were ultimately irrelevant. What happened in those years was an era of, I'm going to use a couple words bigger than I normally use, only because I'm very proud of learning them. Unfortunately, I can't pronounce them more than twice in a row, but that's okay. An era of narcissistic relativism came about. And it is important to really use the right terminology on what happened. And it dominated, this narcissistic relativism dominated the media in the 1960s. It still does. In fact, it so dominated in the 1960s that I believe a lot of the PTSD, the post-traumatic stress syndrome, came about in vets, not from their war experiences, but coming back to a society which was so alien from the society that they left. I know what happened to me. I simply could not believe what I came back to after spending 3 years in Southeast Asia. And like a lot of you, probably, I simply didn't want to be with civilians. I lost girlfriends. It was good news, probably. But literally, it was very difficult. Other than talking to my family, it was really difficult. And some people thought, well, it's just a buddy-buddy system or something like that. But it was more than that. A lot of us came back to society that we didn't get spit on. Very few people got spit on. That's probably overblown. We weren't unloved. It simply was a different society. And that society was driven by the liberal media. The kerosene on the fire of change in the 1960s and 70s was American media. The civil liberty demanding, anti-establishment, drug ingesting, sexual revolution, social and moral upheaval in America, combined with this narcissistic relativism, impact and it changed the conduct and outcome of the Vietnam War, rather than the traditional idea that the war affected America negatively. But what happened in Vietnam toward the last years of the war, in which there were fraggings and almost revolution among the troops, drug use, that was a reflection of American society being imported into Vietnam. You had drug users being drafted to the Army or in the Marine Corps, well, mostly the Army. But, sorry. Have you guys heard the old saying, most Marine, always Marine? Yeah, probably. Okay. Anyway, we talk about what had happened, what was happening in Vietnam, and then disrupting the society coming back in America. It's not true. It was what was happening in America being imported or exported into Vietnam among our troops. Our troops were coming from places that had had the Watts riots, that had burnings of our ROTC headquarters, that had all kinds of things. What were they going to think when they get to combat? And most of you know combat is not easy, and it's incredibly stressful, and you're searching for all kinds of things within your buddies. And you're coming from a society which is disrupting, which is disruptive, and it seems to be self-imploding. Relativism, just in case some of you might have forgotten, is a concept that points of view have no absolute truth or validity, having only subjective value according to differences in perception and consideration. And of course, this is what's happening in America now, but it started, I think, with the media, basically in the Vietnam era. In a relativistic world, democracy cannot be defined as better than communism. It's just simply two different points of view. It's a fact. It's a little tie-in that you'll get to later, I'll get to later. And in fact, a lot of the anti-left got that idea embedded in them from working with communists in the United States. In another life, I actually chased those communists, and we caught some of them. And I didn't just go to graduate school in Mexico. And what we were doing down there was trying to disrupt an incredible chain of Americans coming through Mexico, into Cuba, into Pyongyang, into Russia, terrorist camp, propaganda camps, back to Pyongyang, back to Havana, back to Mexico City, and coming up on the American campuses. And they did a lot of trouble. They did a lot of damage. So during the war, back when I was saying earlier, it wasn't an accident that so much of the media became kind of anti-American and leftist. They didn't just have some epiphany someday at their desk, say, you know what, I don't think America is very good. No, they were told, a lot of it, by communist propagandists, by communist infiltration, by leftist infiltration for other countries, that America was evil. And once you start believing that America is no better than any place else, it's very, very difficult to fight a war on its behalf. And that's something the communists learned long before we learned. Now, some of you, probably not few in this room, but some people say, isn't it time to quit beating up on the press and charbroiling Jane Fonda every time she's mentioned? And of course, I always say, no, it's not. Because a biased media, the self-appointed enforcers of political correctness, it's ruining the country, and it's ruining the country today. And I believe the root of the problem started in Vietnam, a time when the greatest threat America faced, communist aggression, was glossed over by the media's successful defenestration of Joseph McCarthy. I wasn't old enough to know a lot about Joe McCarthy. I've read a lot about him since, and I would just urge any of you who thinks he's just the most evil person in the world to just try to get a decent book on Joe McCarthy and look at what he said. He wasn't a good guy. I'm not sure he would have been anybody's best friend in this room. But read what he said about what was happening in today's light and see how bad a person Joe McCarthy was. The damage done by people like Jane Fonda and the press that simply hammered and hammered on America's evilness is painful and it's long-lasting. And that's why I still talk about it. That's why I'll continue to talk about it. It affects the culture of our country, the country's view of the world, and a very dangerous world's view of us. And among the many ways it does that is by spewing anti-American propaganda. It unnecessarily, see it, Carrie? He had already excused himself. The rest of you didn't get permission, so stay seated. Now, I know some of you have to go, and I don't take it personal at all. I take no umbrage. I figure it's just a haircut.
He bought a note from home.
Yeah. He's also a communist, a lot of you guys didn't know. Yeah, he's one of these guys I'm talking about. Yeah, the next one gets up, you know he's a communist too. Uh-oh, there he is. We'll out the baguette. Now, if you look at some just recent examples, Abu Ghraib is a horrible thing. I mean, the people around that would just be horsewhipped to put in prison themselves. 14 million stories about Abu Ghraib on the internet. 14 million. They wouldn't let it die. The first beheading of an American, 7,000 stories. The imbalance is so great that we have to pay some attention and try to have some common sense about what we're saying and what we let people say about America. It's going to be very difficult. John Del Vecchio, who was a Marine vet, wrote a really good book. Bless me, I can't remember the name of it right now. I think it was the 13th Valley, if I remember. But anyway, he wrote an essay called The Importance of Story. And he likened the culture of a country to an individual's personality. And the difference between a good individual and a bad individual, a lot of it is greatly due to how the person thinks of themselves or herself. And it's the same with countries. Beginning sometime in the Vietnam War, a significant portion of the major media decided it had higher moral standards than the rest of America. And that it could call it an unjust war, didn't have to justify it, didn't have to prove why it was, just says it's an unjust war, and just print that everywhere. People start reading it as an unjust war. My country, right or wrong, became, during the Vietnam era, my country, probably wrong. They decided, the American liberal media, that there was no such thing as American exceptionalism. No American ethic, no American spirit. Altruism was cynically dismissed and derided. And they adopted a policy, a religion of relativism. There is no right or wrong. They adopted the policy of moral equivalency. If we had a My Lai, how could we criticize the communists? Forgetting the fact that overwhelmingly the communists were more brutal, it's more frequent. It was a matter of policy to torture and kill civilians. But the moral equivalency stance of the American media said, well, they're bad, we're bad, let's just kind of get on with it. So the cynicism and the arrogance is just unbelievable in the media. G.K. Chesterton said, impartiality is a pompous name for indifference, which is an elegant name for ignorance. The American media, in print and in person, have said, we think we ought to be impartial on our reporting around the world. Really? See, I don't believe it. What that has brought us is political correctness. Political correctness is how you enforce this ideology, which is the Marxist, as Marxism is to economy, political correctness is to our culture. We're forced to be politically correct. And political correctness rewrites history. It basically says, this is what's right, and if you say anything else, then you're wrong by definition, by our definition. But I'm not getting too deep in political correctness. All of us know and all of us experience. The problem is that political correctness is probably the single greatest threat to our personal freedoms. If we can't protest, if we can't call a wrong, then how do we ever correct a wrong? The negativism and distrust of government and institutions began in the U.S. It wasn't because of the war. The war just gave them an excuse to be on the streets. It gave the organizers and activists of the 60s a rallying point. And the civil unrest and the thuggery, so often celebrated by the press, gave rise to minor and major insurrections that occurred in the military in the last years of the war. Ironically, when the U.S. was unequivocally winning the Vietnam War. I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit because I want to give you a chance to ask a couple of questions. But just talking about the American media. Who was it that decided Abby Hoffman or David Dillinger or the average 19-year-old college student knew more about the Vietnam War and had a more accurate moral compass than our military? It was American media. Who was it that decided our troops in Vietnam were on a hopeless, helpless, foolhardy mission in Southeast Asia? The American media. Who was it that put the killing of Kent State students on the moral par with the rape of Nanking? The American liberal media. Who was it that put Che Guevara in Mao Zedong t-shirts on American college students, celebrating as if that were a great thing? It was American media. The American media, beginning in earnest in the Vietnam War, with this mantra of having an open mind and impartiality and relativism, and it just simply legitimized communism. The Cold War continued, and there were ebbs and flows of confrontation between us and the communists. And Ronald Reagan finally buried the USSR. But by that time, being a communist was kind of like just another guy who's a Democrat or a communist or something, you know. And there wasn't any real stigma to it. People still laugh at it. They laugh at it when I give this talk about communism. Yeah, communists. The problem is the USSR wasn't communism. USSR, we did put it in the dustbin. That's not communism. They were communists. Communism, Marxism, socialism, deep socialism, still is a pervasive enemy of the United States today. Here's a bit of homework. A lot of you remember John Kerry's statement before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in April of 1973. I'm going to tease you a bit. See if you can find out who wrote most of the parts of that speech and when they were first published. Taylor will help you. He's a brilliant guy if you can't figure it out. And here's my point. It isn't my imagination that guys like Posipa, who was head of the Communist Propaganda Party for a long time he actually was in Hungary, or no, Romania. Anyway, the Communist Party propaganda machine wrote a great deal of every anti-American slogan you've ever read in the last 50 years, including parts of John Kerry's speech, like Genghis Khan and things like that. It was written by communists. And what the communists would do, when I was with the agency, this was the part that I kind of dealt in, the propagandists and how it affected us. What they would do is they would publish a speech, get it published in a European newspaper. The European newspaper speech would be picked up by an American newspaper so that a speaker in the United States could quote the New York Times or somebody saying, according to the New York Times, American troops today slaughtered 55 civilians and so on and so on and so on. And this quote American. So a loss was the fact that that story came out of some propaganda machine in communist Russia. And after the war, Andropov said that the propaganda victory in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, was the greatest victory ever. They simply overwhelmed American news, overwhelmed American propaganda, and in fact helped South Vietnam or North Vietnam win the war. Now, all American media is not bad. One of my best friends, a guy named Peter Kahn, went on to run the Wall Street Journal. I met Peter in 1968. He was a brilliant reporter, and he did great reporting. A lot of good things happened. And I understand that me lies have to be reported. You cannot hide a me lie. Those are terrible, evil things. But simply when you bias the reporting so bad that there is no context of America's evilness, you're going to create what we have in the country today. And that is a loss of the sense of America, a loss of sense of our place in history, a loss of the sense of America having the strength and the power to do good things. We simply have to understand that somehow we're going to come to grips with common sense when it comes to media, and particularly media during wartime. I hate the word censorship, but what do you do? How can you allow media to publish troop movements or casualties and hammer on about things like Abu Ghraib way beyond their importance in any kind of military operation? We simply can't do it. We have to have secrets. Here's the hard part. To have secrets in the American government, we have to elect leaders the American people trust. It's a challenge to me that seems almost insurmountable. I really don't know how we're going to do it. But if you think about it, what else can we do? We have to have leaders American people trust. You simply cannot have a world with no secrecy. You can't have diplomacy, you can't have business, you can't have, certainly have espionage. We have to have leaders we can trust. And whatever it takes, we've got to do that. I appreciate very much being here. I love being around Vietnam vets. It's a great part of my life. I kind of miss it. There was some simplicity of just kind of living through a day rather than all the things we have to put up now. I appreciate General Taylor inviting me, and God bless you all.
Official time for you. Thank you so much. Our next meeting will be the first Tuesday of next month. Thank you so much for coming.